All right, so we are in the home stretch. We have one final panel, and then I hope you'll stay and join us for a reception. We even brought cupcakes in from Richmond, Pearl's Bake Shop, so you don't want to miss them. But we do have one more panel. So we're going to start first with video remarks by Martha Minow, who is the 300th anniversary university professor at Harvard Law School. We then will hear from Mark Rosenbaum, who's the director of public counsel, Opportunity Under Law. We then will have the honor of hearing from Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, who's a 97 graduate of UVA Law and the U.S. Representative for the 4th District of Virginia. We then will hear from Dr. Kristine Bowman, who is the Associate Dean of Academic and Student Affairs and a professor of education policy at Michigan State University. And last but not least, we will hear from Joshua Weishart, who is a professor of law at West Virginia University College of Law. As with the first panel, more detailed bios are available in the program, and we continue to live stream the event. So with that, I will start the video.
This nation has never lived up to the promise of equal opportunity, and yet it is fundamental to the constitutional vision and indeed the ethical vision of the United States. That is why the opening of this Education Rights Institute at the University of Virginia is so compelling. And there could be no greater leader than Professor Kimberly Robinson. Professor Robinson combines the intellectual rigor, professional policy expertise, and personal passion that will make the Institute a force for good. Indeed, it is her work that inspired the creation of the Institute, and it is her leadership that will assure its success. Knowledge of the critical building blocks of high-quality education is key. So is a laser focus on the persistent failures to deliver those critical components for especially low-income students, students of color, often living just a mile or two away from other students getting a very different set of opportunities. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 remains a vital resource. I look forward to seeing the work of the Institute, including collaborations across federal, state, and local governments and across public and private actors, uniting methods of teaching and learning with emerging tools, even from new technologies and research. Genuine educational opportunity means that anyone and everyone can join in the project of self-governance, developing personal talents, making a living, contributing to society. A well-functioning democratic society would make this vision real. And actually, a society cannot be a well-functioning democracy unless it makes this vision real. With hope and excitement, I salute the launch of the Education Rights Institute and Professor Robinson's leadership.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am really honored to be here, privileged to be here among my colleagues who have been on this panel and among leadership like Kimberly Robinson. So kind of you to have us here today, have this conversation. And you heard from Kimberly's comments today how much she gets it. Her talk was not about overruling a case like Rodriguez because of some doctrinal problem, but because of what's involved here is a right. Enough talking about discretion, policy choices. It is a basic right of children. And that's what the Institute's mission is, and that really should be all our mission. And then, even more than that, when Kimberly talked to you about her experience. This is about a love of children. It's about seeing herself in children across the country and saying what is their due and what must take place for all kids. Kimberly asked me to talk about the Detroit case, a case we filed in 2016 to establish a constitutional right under the 14th Amendment of access to literacy. Now, when you think about it, in 2023, we shouldn't need an Education Rights Institute. I'm glad we have it, and I'm glad it's under your leadership. But there should be no need for such an institute, nor should there be such a need to establish a right of access to literacy, a right of education, a right to read. Kimberly asked me to talk about what were some of the steps that led to that case being filed, and I want to talk to you about two in particular. One was a meeting of social scientists. Prudence was there, Jeannie Oakes was there, who was mentioned earlier today, Sean was there. Sean actually showed that chart, and he said, you know, there's not a single school above that median that is principally black or Latinx or low-income children. You could pick any of those districts below. In fact, we know there's not a single school in this country named after Dr. King or Cesar Chavez where any leadership who was being sued in these cases would ever send their schools. But there was another reason that made Detroit, Sean said Detroit really is ground zero, but there was another reason that made Detroit the perfect place to begin this case, and that was the grassroots movements that were existing in Detroit. You know, in 1963, Dr. King, along with Reverend Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, had a march to freedom. And the basic right that they talked about was a right of education. And it's so important for us to recognize that this struggle isn't beginning with lawyers and it isn't beginning with social scientists, but it is beginning with the people who care about their children, who care about all children, and who have made it a point of struggle. I think it's really important not just to change the basic framework, but to talk about the basic themes. What's the basic story here? And who should the storytellers be? And we know from our own lives that the storytellers who mean the most to us are the kids themselves, and it's those voices that we have to work hard to hear. I don't believe that the educational systems that you have seen data on today are a byproduct of deficient educational systems. Accidents, coincidence. I believe that those systems are in fact intended end products. That is the angel and the devil that was on Jefferson's shoulders. He did not envision education for kids who are in fact like the kids who go to this school or the kids that we're talking about. Look, the inferior educational opportunities that are afforded children of color and children from low-income families throughout the United States have been demonstrated to be one of the most effective racist policies ever devised to attempt to degrade Black and Latinx and low-income children, to attempt to subordinate those children, to attempt to legally exclude them from our political processes, to attempt to disenfranchise them and their communities from meaningful opportunity within our political systems. Bob Moses, after the Detroit case came down, Bob Moses, the legendary organizer, called me and said that when he was involved in the freedom marches, that he was told by a federal judge, why do you want these illiterate children to be able to vote? What he talked about was a concept of sharecropper education, educating children in the communities that we're talking about to be the sharecroppers for the rest of the community itself. And that's the basic theme, isn't it? The basic theme here is whether or not we really believe that these children have the opportunity, should even have a fighting chance to better their circumstances and to become meaningful participants in our political system. You know, the dream of public education was that it would be the great equalizer. And just like it was once a crime, punishable by death, to educate black children, just like the Klan went after teachers of black children, just like there were literacy tests to keep individuals from voting because they hadn't had an education. Now education, public education, which every speaker has talked about today, and which, damn it, we know there is an attack on, an assault on, that public education, which was supposed to be the great equalizer, has become the great unequalizer in our society. And that's not an accident. Think about the conditions we saw in Detroit. And one of the things I want to say to students, because you are the most important people in this audience, one of the things I want to say to students is, I'm often asked, what's it take to be a good lawyer? Like your colleague Charles Ogletree, who's one of the great, great American lawyers. And what it takes more than anything else, it's not a knowledge of law books, it's being a good listener. I remember in Detroit, a young man who point guard on his high school team, as smart as anybody in this room, as smart as any kid you know. He wanted to be an accountant, but he hadn't even been taught double-digit multiplication. And he was on a travel team, basketball team. And he went into schools in Grosse Pointe and Bloomfield Hills and Ann Arbor, and he saw these high schools, gyms, that the Lakers could have played in. And then he went to his school, he took me to his school, where the gym was 100 degrees, and you could see rats running around. And he took me down to the locker room, and they didn't have showers. He had a book bag. And I said, look, Jabari, I know you don't get homework in your school. I never met a kid in Detroit who had homework. I said, why do you have a book bag? He said, because I need an extra set of clothes because we don't have showers. And the water in that gym was the same water that was in Flint. There were garbage bags over the drinking fountains because you couldn't drink that water. And there were no showers. Students in that school was short 200 teachers in the whole Detroit school system. I don't mean bad teachers, I mean no teachers. 200 teachers. There was a law passed in Michigan that said that uncertified teachers could teach in the Detroit school system. Imagine that. I never saw a kid have a book to take home. The books that I saw in Detroit had in 2016, had as the President of the United States Bill Clinton. They had no science books. They had some biology old books that had been donated or off of online volunteer books, or their teachers spent out their own money to get books at garage sales. And they would take pages that might talk about chemistry, that might talk about physics, and that was their text. They didn't have experiments. They took the same courses over and over again. They looked at pictures of how you dissect a frog, but they could never dissect a frog themselves. The temperatures in that classroom, and I saw teachers pass out, and I saw students pass out, and I saw students throw up because it would be 100 degrees or it was so cold that they would have coats and jackets on. The rats were running around. You could smell the black mold. In high school, seniors were not asked to read out loud, or if they did, they were embarrassed. They were stigmatized because they couldn't pronounce certain words. They didn't know certain words. I saw seniors in high school do word searches. I heard them read stories out loud. They had picture books in high school because they hadn't been taught how to read properly. And who ran those schools? The state of Michigan ran those schools. And who did they pick to run those schools as so-called emergency managers because they wanted to destroy the public school system? The same person who was in charge of the Flint Water program was one of the emergency managers. They never had anyone in that school system who had any background in education whatsoever. Now, I know that one of the science teachers I saw for two months was an 8th grader because they didn't have adults filling it in. She taught 7th and 8th grade, and she was an 8th grader. I want to say two things, and then I'll finish up. The first thing is, it isn't because there isn't a legal theory. That's nonsense. We have a notion here of a fundamental right, which has to be grounded in liberty. Look, when the 14th Amendment was passed, 36 out of 37 states actually had systems of public education. So when you hear about originalism, that's nonsense. They had that basic right. Can you have liberty? Can you have liberty when there, in fact, you cannot read? You cannot read fully? You cannot meet your potential? Or even think about it out of the context of education. What they did in Detroit, and I want to emphasize that the schools in Detroit may be extreme, but as John said to me, there are schools like that in every low-income community, every community of color. If you take kids and you compel them to be educated, you have compulsory attendance, then you are warehousing those children. And that is a basic violation of liberty, education or not. You cannot do that to kids. You can't put prisoners in a prison where you don't give them food, where you don't give them some opportunity. You can't put people in a mental institution, but damn it, you can do it to children, which is the last thing I want to say. Sometimes people come up to me and they say, Mark, I just want to really say to you, appreciate what you do, how you give back. And I know they're giving me a compliment, but it couldn't be furthest from the truth. I don't give back anything. I get everything. My ability, my life, my ability as a lawyer, as a father, as a friend, and as a lover, to have a community like this, and more importantly, to know children like Jamarie, and to be able to spend my life with those kids and talk to those kids and be enriched by those kids, to have that as part of my life, that is the best life on the planet. So I say to the young people, don't do it out of a sense of obligation. Don't do it out of a sense out of noblesse oblige. Don't do it out of any paternalistic notion. Do it because it's good for you, because it makes you a better person, because it makes you the person you were intended to be. And if you don't love children, then you can live with the data you saw today. But if you do, then you got to tear that down. You got to join that struggle, not be that struggle, but join that struggle, because that struggle is as old as this nation. There is an ugly monument to it, 15 minutes in Monticello, and you can win. We settled in July for $94.4 million for that system. That is a victory. It doesn't do everything that needs to get done, but that is a victory. But the biggest victory is that those kids took on the state of Michigan and they won, and you can win too, to be part of that struggle.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm going to talk about two rights, both of which, or I should say neither of which, were guaranteed when this country was founded. The right to vote and the right to an education. And I want to talk about both of them because they're interconnected. A strong public education system is not only key to individual opportunity and the opportunity for economic success, but is key to thriving, healthy communities and a thriving, healthy democracy. But from our founding, the right to participate in our democracy, and I use air quotes, and the right to an education were limited to wealthy, land-owning, white men. I'm here to give you a history lesson. I'll give you the short version. When Jamestown was founded as a business venture, that's the first time we had a vote to put someone in charge of governing anybody in what would become America. When they arrived with instructions to elect a leader. Not everyone was allowed to participate from day one. John Smith got on their nerves so bad that they tied him up and said, stay over here and don't participate. So from day one, there was voter suppression. I will spare you, but I invite you to read an article that I wrote that gives a 50-page history of voting rights in Virginia. The short version is that the struggle from 1607 to 2023 for our democracy was, how do we give truth to the idea of a government by, of, and for the people? And throughout that period, there was a fundamental debate. Is there a fundamental right to vote, or is the right to vote a privilege? That's the same debate that we've had with education for most of our country's history, until after the Civil War in many states, and I'll just focus on Virginia today. After the Civil War, when Virginia had its constitutional convention to readmit Virginia back into the Union, that was the first time that African American men participated in our government by, of, and for the people. 22 of them. That was the first time that a right to public education was included in a constitution in Virginia. And it's been there ever since. But that happened right around the same time as the 14th Amendment, and we know from day one that the education provided was not equal. Now I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask you to put a pin in that for a minute, because we're here to talk about educational policy. I want to remind everyone of a lesson that I learned very quickly when I became a member of the House of Delegates 18 years ago. And it's been true my entire political and legislative career. Everyone's political views, their policy views, are shaped by their life experiences and what they know. What they're taught in school, what they learn at home, what their family lore has taught them. So my view on education and the right to vote is shaped not by what I learned in school, because that was very limited as far as our history, but from my family. And I'll just focus on education. My dad's side of the family, he was born in 1925 in Nashville, Tennessee. He spent half of the year, the school year, in Alabama, because the schools in Nashville for black children were terrible, if they existed. So his grandparents founded a school in Alabama for the black students in Alabama that my father and his sisters went to. And they, as a result, and his family, as a result, was part of the black middle class in Nashville. You've heard of the Harlem of Richmond. They basically lived in the Harlem of Tennessee and Nashville. My grandfather ultimately became a lawyer. Yes, in segregated Nashville, but it was because of the education that he and my father received. My mother, born in 1932 in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. The only school in her town was the Catholic Church. It went to the 8th grade. That's it. So everybody in her family and everybody in her town, when you graduated, if you were a woman, you became a domestic. If you were a man, you went in the military or you worked for a factory. She was the first, the third youngest of 14 children, after working, to move to Jackson to go to school and ultimately graduate. And I saw firsthand, listening to their stories, the difference that an education made in my own family history. I took those life experiences with me to the House of Delegates, where I quickly figured out the fundamental problem of educational inequity lies in how we fund our education system, based primarily on property taxes, that bakes inequity into the system. And you put on top of that the fact that the tax base in many localities, and even within localities, is tied to a history of Jim Crow, is tied to policy decisions that destroyed neighborhoods, building highways in the name of progress, that cut neighborhoods off from jobs, that relegated black people to jobs that didn't pay minimum wage and were exempted from every worker protection that we take for granted, whether it's minimum wage, anti-discrimination, or wage theft. Economic policy, transportation policy, healthcare policy, voting policy, education policy are all related. Because today, I'll just take the city of Richmond. Many of our students walk in the door already behind. I'll throw one other policy in there. I hope that your institute is focusing before kindergarten. If not, you're setting yourself up to fail from day one. I'll come back to that. You have kids who show up hungry in a building that's literally fallen apart, who have mental health challenges, who have suffered trauma regularly at home or in their neighborhood, whose parents are struggling to put food on the table and meet ends meet, who are often not available to help them with their homework, not because they don't care, because they're working 3 jobs in some cases. And testing that assumes that every child learns the same, comes in the door with the same starting block, and has a hurdle-free path to graduation. Testing and curricula that assume that set these children up to fail. Now, why should you start at pre-K? When my son started kindergarten, I asked his teacher, who had been teaching for 20 years, what's the biggest difference? And she said, kindergarten used to be where you learn the soft skills. Kindergarten now is all academic. And she can tell on day one who had some formal early childhood education and who didn't. And as she told me that, there was a mother, this was at the not the first day of school, but right before the first day of school. There was a mother who was almost apologetic as her son was kind of bouncing off the walls. She said, I didn't have him in pre-K, I didn't have him in daycare, I had him at home. And I thought it was odd that she was apologizing for that, until my son, who's a tattletale, I call him the mouth of the South, would come home. Mommy, so-and-so got in trouble. Ms. Blumberg had to spend half of the day dealing with so-and-so and his disruptions. Guess who the so-and-so was? It was that same kid who was bouncing off the walls on day one. That's where the education gap begins, at birth. Because when you have studies that are showing 90% of your brain is developed before you're 5, 80% of your brain is developed before you're 3, and yet we are not focused on a fundamental right to early childhood education from birth to 5th grade, we're focusing on a right that starts at 5th grade, it's too late. It's too late. When they show up at the door, the education gap has already begun. And if we are not focusing on addressing that, they will never catch up. And I'm sure we will get into a little more discussion on that as we go.
Good afternoon. I'm Kristine Bowman from Michigan State University, and it is an incredible privilege to be here this afternoon as part of the launch of this institute and with my fellow panelists and those earlier. So here are a few thoughts that I'd like to share. First, a couple of lessons that I hope we've learned, and then thinking about where we might be going next. But before we launch into this, I want to remind us of something. Roughly 90% of American school children attend public schools. And for me, that means that's an incredible opportunity. There's a lot that is not going well in some public schools. There's also a lot that's going well. I'm a product of public schools. I know a lot of other folks are as well. And why I emphasize this 90% number, though, is think of what an incredible market share that is. Right? So think about if we can get it right, if we can learn from DOD, if we can implement all of these things, what a phenomenal opportunity for impact that is. So as I was thinking, this semester I'm teaching an education law and policy class. And in that class, I enroll education doctoral students and also law students. And I love having these two groups together. And so we've been thinking somewhat about basically what have we learned over the past 80 years of litigation, of legislation, of activism, and of pursuit of educational rights. And here's one thing I suggest that we have learned: the need for an interconnected strategy. Because right now, we have all of these different things going on, all of these different incredible lines of research, all of this sophisticated litigation. We have interesting legislative proposals, but a lot of times it doesn't connect. And so where it does connect, we see bright flashes. Where it does connect, we see opportunities. Where it does connect, where we have multidisciplinary opportunities to engage like we have today, we have the potential to come together and create greater change. And I would like to suggest that it's probably not an accident that who you're hearing from today includes a lawyer, it includes a congresswoman, it includes scholars in education with backgrounds in sociology and economics, it includes legal scholars. There are so many people, so many different perspectives that are critical to solving this challenge of the opportunity gap. And I also want to be very clear, because this is something I think we don't say a lot in law school, maybe unless you're in a clinic, that those who advocate for education rights don't merely seek formal legal change. Yes, thinking about the puzzle of precedent is absolutely part of it, but they do that because we are seeking real change in the lives of real children. It's about the impact, it's about the effect. And so we've seen all of these different things happening: judicial opinions, legislation, executive agency orders, and you can continue to read the list. All of these different really incredible things happening. And we need to connect these, and this is, I think, one of the wonderful opportunities that the Education Rights Institute, particularly with Kimberly's leadership, gives us. So that's the first lesson that I want to suggest. Here's the second one: the need for a federal level strategy. And this echoes things that we've heard all throughout the day. The need for a federal level strategy. You've heard this come up time and time again in many different ways. And I just want to make a couple of quick points here. So, as I write about this, sometimes folks will say, well, doesn't every state have a state right to education in their constitution? Yes, they do. But you know what? How's that working out? And in states like Michigan, our state courts have basically said, oh, we're not going to touch that. It's like they're backing away from a basketball just before it goes out of bounds. Oh, not mine. I didn't touch that. And so in some states, like Michigan, state courts are not an option. But you know what? Our state constitutional language is pretty much the same as the state constitutional language in Kentucky, which was the site of the Rose litigation. Now, how the Rose litigation has played out is also a complicated and longer story, but those of us in education law know the Rose litigation as the source of a really robust definition of education rights. And it's the Rose litigation that is part of 50 years of school finance litigation that we have seen across the US. So we've seen all of this happening. And to summarize what we heard particularly in the prior panel, educational opportunity today in the US, not distributed fairly, not distributed neutrally, not distributed equally, not distributed equitably. So keeping those two things in mind as I suggest collective lessons that we've learned, I want to move on to thinking about a few things that we can be doing differently going forward. And I've learned a lot from my colleagues in the College of Education about this, really centering the needs of communities. And this is something that I commend Mark Rosenbaum tremendously for doing in Detroit. Getting to know the kids, getting to know the community activists, getting to know the people in the community, and not just going in there and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, but really getting to know them as human beings, having them be part of the process. And I think that is a wonderful example of what we need to be doing in litigation moving forward. So law students in particular, I hope you're hearing that. But also in legislation, really thinking about community members as partners. And we can define communities in a lot of different ways. We can think about communities demographically, we can think about communities geographically. Now, this idea of really partnering with communities, of really listening to and centering people in communities, it's not mine. Definitely credit goes to Derek Bell on this for a really provocative article written almost 50 years ago, Serving Two Masters, about plaintiffs' attorneys in school desegregation and the role that they play and the role that they navigate and negotiate as they go forward. Now, the last thing I want to note here refers again back to Michigan's right to literacy litigation, which Mark led. Now, the picture up here is Jamarie Hall. Jamarie is one of the students, now he's an adult, who Mark got to know during, certainly prior to and then continuing through the litigation. Jamarie also has remained a critical voice in education in Detroit, and he's become an education activist. And I also was thrilled a few years ago to moderate a panel at AEFP, Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. It was their keynote panel. It was about the Detroit right to literacy litigation, and Jamarie was a panelist on that. And so sharing his voice and sharing his perspective with that group was really impactful. So looking forward, centering the needs of communities. So let's think about this in a couple of different ways. So I'm going to share a couple of data snapshots with us. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a basic demographic breakdown, census data compiled by the National Center on Education Statistics. And this shows us change over time. So the navy or black on the left is fall 2010, fall 21 is the purple, and then fall 2031, projected of course, is the yellow on the right. And so what we see here, of course, is, well, 2 or more races growing substantially, white population decreasing substantially, Latino population increasing substantially, Black decreasing a bit, Asian increasing a bit. And this is enrollment in public elementary and secondary schools. So why am I sharing this? First, to remind us what the national context is, because our individual contexts in our communities, in our kids' public schools or other schools, our individual in our neighborhoods, our experiences don't usually look like this. And I also want us to be thinking ahead, again, to the changing demographics that we're looking at. As part of that, we need to think about changes in English language learners. Now, on the upper left, we see in the year 2000 where English language learners were distributed. Darkest blue is the highest concentration, up to 25%. In the middle, that fast forwards 10 years to 2010. Okay, so we see the dark blue has moved a little, and basically we see growing expansion, particularly along the Missouri River and in the Midwest. Bottom right, 2019, as close as we are for today, we see substantial presence of English language learners in communities all across the country. So as we're thinking about educational opportunity, continuing to think significantly about the needs of English language learners is a huge part of this. And in the US, about 75% of our ELLs today are native Spanish speakers, and about 25% are Asian or Asian Americans. Now, last, I want to leave us with this and then one more thought. I want us to also think about rural, non-rural divide. And we've talked about poverty earlier today, and thinking also about overlaying poverty on top of race and ethnicity. Now here, this is overlaying rurality on top of race and ethnicity. And here it's important to disaggregate the data. So what we're looking at here, essentially, the line across the middle shows us average achievement. In the dark blue, we have achievement of our rural groups. In the light blue, achievement of non-rural. So Asian Americans, the non-rural achieve higher than the rural. Same as we go to Black, right? So both of the subpopulations of Black students are achieving below average, but the rural students are further behind. And so we see that continue across. And I'm thinking, as I look at the Native American portion, I'm thinking of Sean's experience that he shared with us earlier today as well. So this is the last data point that I want to leave us with. And the last concept I want to leave us with is actually circling back to the beginning of my comments and sharing that in law, we're taught to look for the harm. We're taught to look for the damage. We're taught to look for the deficit. And so what that often does is we operate from a deficit mindset. And so I think a challenge, particularly from those of us in law, is to think about how we reconceptualize law, how we reconceptualize policy and litigation, so we're not always thinking about a deficit mindset. For example, if we think about dual language immersion programs, where we have one group who's native English speakers, the other group is not native English speakers, the goal of that sort of program is for both groups to become fluent in the other language and not only to become bilingual, but bicultural. The reason I mention that is because the minoritized group's language ability in that context is an asset. It's not just that they're not English speakers, it's that they bring this other tremendous thing to the table. And so I think that's part of what we need to think about as attorneys and policymakers and others work within communities, that even if we're thinking about law as a tool for social change, where we need to be focusing on deficits and test scores and those sort of things, that we're also really appreciating the complexity and the strengths that individual communities have. So, again, such a pleasure to be here today. I am so excited for this institute and for everything that it will lead to. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for launching this.
Point of privilege for me, as someone who devotes all his scholarship to education rights, I couldn't be more excited for this institute and counted a high professional honor to be part of today's program. So I've been tasked to conclude the panel by explaining why we should center the discussion around a federal right to education and what we can do now to improve educational opportunities as we move toward that goal. And I understand that goal might seem so distant and impractical given the current political climate. But let me start with some good news. We're closer than you might think. First of all, there are federal rights in education. The U.S. Constitution, in fact, confers rights in education. Most prominently, of course, children have the constitutional right to against intentional racially segregated schooling. That's the holding in Brown. Extending the logic of another decision, Plyler versus Doe, all children, not just undocumented children, would have a constitutional right to a basic public education to protect them from certain personal, economic, and social harms of absolute deprivation. The Supreme Court has also recognized that students have constitutional due process protections against being excluded from the education process, which presumably would extend beyond the school discipline context. There are, in fact, eroding but still functional First Amendment protections for students that have taken on new significance in light of the rash of discriminatory censorship laws that are sweeping the nation as we speak. In addition to constitutional rights, there are federal statutory rights, the Civil Rights Act, ESSA, IDEA, which embody commitments to equal educational opportunity, while also providing important procedural and substantive protections. Add in the plethora of state law protections, take a step back, and you'll see that in reality, there's an entire constellation of education rights at our disposal now. Now, of course, we are still looking for that North Star in the constellation, the one dependable navigation point illuminating our path forward, the one all-encompassing federal right to education. I have described the scholarly pursuit of a federal right to education as the quest for the holy grail of rights. It's a quest that has captured the imagination of scores of scholars, including the likes of Chemerinsky and Sunstein and Ogletree and your very own distinguished Professor Robinson and Professor Ryan, then Professor Ryan back in the day. All that scholarship hasn't been in vain. It's just been redirected at times, influencing courts and advocates who have been, meanwhile, evolving the state constitutional right to education. It is in state courts where we made the most progress. But this is another reason why we are closer to a federal right to education than we might think, because much of the conceptual groundwork for a federal right to education has already been tried and tested in a half century of school funding litigation in state courts. And so the question might be, considering the strictures of federalism, do we really need an overriding federal right to education? And the answer is absolutely we do. And not just because there's greater inequality between states than within them, and not because we necessarily think that federal courts are any better than state courts in enforcing rights, and not because we think that Congress will necessarily be more functional than state legislatures. The best argument for a federal right to education is a moral one. Children morally deserve the promises and guarantees of national citizenship. And recognition of a federal right to education, whether that comes through legislation, judicial decree, ratification, is fundamentally a moral statement about who we are as a people and about ultimately what we value. So we have this constellation of rights accompanied by a good body of case law interpreting and enforcing their rights complemented by a responsive body of legal scholarship. Can we use all this accumulated wisdom to set forth a broad vision of a federal right to education? I think we can. And with the caveat, of course, that there will always be details and disagreements to work through. My sense is that we can coalesce around 4 foundational principles for a federal right to education: equity, adequacy, democracy, and humanity. Equity, because children have different educational needs, and so providing all the same would mean that those with greater educational needs get shortchanged. Demanding equal opportunity does not require equal treatment. It instead requires treating children as equals by insisting that all their educational needs are met, even if some need more than others. Adequacy, which is synonymous with a high-quality education, enough to give children a meaningful opportunity to achieve certain desired outcomes. Most notably, the education is adequate if it imparts real freedom on children to become equal citizens, productive members of society, to live life as they wish. We used to debate about whether we needed equity or adequacy. We don't have that debate much anymore because there can be no educational justice without both. Equity without adequacy has no direction. Adequacy without equity has no soul. Without qualitative standards to measure adequacy, it's too difficult to define, much less manage educational opportunity. Without some imperative to do something about disadvantage to assure equity, it's too easy to tolerate gross disparities in educational opportunity. So we need both. Democracy. The core legal purpose of public education is to democratize school children. It's a settled point. So says the Supreme Court, so say state constitutions, state courts, so say legal scholars, both conservative and progressive. It's achieved rare unanimity in the law. And perhaps that's why too often this school purpose is taken for granted. But with democracy under assault worldwide, we need to prioritize this school purpose like never before. And if we want to democratize school children, their education itself must be democratic, in the sense that it is democratically governed, geared toward democratic goals, open to all children, inclusive, not segregated by race, class, religion, or disability. But public schooling in the fullest sense of the word, in which children also have a voice in their own education. Humanity. Education is not just a civil right or a political right, it's a human right. If you hear nothing else from my remarks, hear this. We need to value education for its own sake, and stop thinking of education as only a means to some other end, even if those ends are important: functional democracy, productive, robust economy. We need to seriously consider and elevate the intrinsic value of education on the everyday lives of children, to the development of their human personality and potential, to what it means to be distinctively human, to grow and to find meaning with others, and to nurture and cultivate human understanding and friendship through schooling. And dare I say it, we need to consider ways to make schooling more enjoyable and positively meaningful to the lives of children. We, the adults in the room, the lawyers, the scholars, the parents, can at times be so all-consumed with ensuring fairness that we lose sight of how children actually experience school every day. And it matters to them, it should matter to us as a matter of human dignity. Now, assuming we can achieve broad consensus around these goals, it is imperative that we act now for 2 reasons. First, because childhood is too fleeting for us to hold out for some distant future of educational justice that might never come. So consider those state school funding cases. They can take upwards of 10 years to resolve, and even then, those decisions have never fully delivered on a full remedy for children. Children deserve progress now, and and if you look at the education rights cases that have backfired, it's because the litigants have demanded too much of courts and considered too little of the legal claims and remedies that could achieve some incremental but immediate progress for children now. The second reason we shouldn't wait is because we need to keep laying the groundwork for a federal right to education by showing what is possible in the education rights space, even if that means using state education rights as opposed to the federal right. In my remaining time, I just want to highlight 2 issues where I think we can exert that leverage of that constellation of education rights, even as we're looking for the North Star. First, exclusionary and punitive school discipline. So this implicates all 4 of the principles. Equity, because It is the product of bias, which disproportionately impacts students of color, students with disabilities. Adequacy, because we see these disparities more in under-resourced schools, and the research shows that punitive discipline depresses academic achievement for all students, not just those who are disciplined. Democracy, because our zero-tolerance command and control approach to school discipline is more reflective of authoritarian schooling than it is democratic schooling. And humanity, because exclusionary and punitive discipline not only fuels a school-to-prison pipeline, but it causes students, particularly racial minorities, to experience school as prison itself. In the past decade alone, there have been more than 81 studies on how to reduce school discipline disparities. And the U.S. Department of Education has recently issued guidance. It's time we bring all that research plus the full panoply of federal and state education rights to bear on that issue. Second and last is social emotional learning. This isn't just a matter of pedagogy. It is an education rights issue because, again, it implicates all four of those principles. In terms of equity and adequacy, we know that unmet social emotional needs are barriers to academic achievement. They contribute to the opportunity gaps. The pandemic exacerbated those disparities, as we heard. Children are experiencing mental health crisis and anxiety like never before. But research has shown that social emotional learning can improve academic achievement and performance and classroom behavior. As for democracy, civics, and social studies class are not enough to make good citizens. Schools need to model and to cultivate democratic competencies. As for humanity, it should go without saying that social emotional learning is critical to humanizing our approach to schooling itself. Relationships, friendships facilitate learning, but they're also just intrinsically valuable to children. So we have plenty of research, again, and law to exert on social emotional learning, but bottom line for me is this. Children deserve a federal right to education. We are closer than we might think to that federal right, but we need to leverage the federal and state education rights that already exist to improve the lived school experiences of children now.
Thank you for all of those remarks. So I want to start off with a question, and I want to first actually call in Congresswoman McClellan. When we think about law and policy reforms, and I am for the moment actually setting aside a federal right to education because we've talked some about that. How else should we think about the federal role in education in ways that would be bold and that would disrupt the opportunity gaps that exist? How might we think about that? And it's for all the panelists, but I just first wanted to hear from her.
Well, first we have to acknowledge that we are living in a time where more than ever before you have members of Congress and presidential candidates who don't believe the federal government should be involved in education at all, and are actually running for office pledging to abolish the Department of Education. So I think we have to acknowledge that complicates things. However, I think there are opportunities for partnership and collaboration between rural and urban legislators who often face the same problems in their school systems, the first being funding, to help push the paradigm on its head. And part of the paradigm that we're fighting against is the fundamental belief, and again, I'll just focus on Virginia. There is a fundamental belief in the way our state constitution is set up, it reflects this, that the local government should be in control of the day-to-day operation of the school. And there is a blurring of the line between what does it mean to be in charge of the fundamental day-to-day operation of the school and to set the overarching policy for the school. And for too long, and there are a lot of reasons for why, but for too long, the discussion of where that balance should be, let alone adding the federal government into it, has been complicated by the history of racial discrimination in our school system. And I think the federal level is a good place to first have that conversation and try to connect the dots between the past and the present, and try to connect the dots between how different policies that we regulate in a silo at the federal, state, and local level need to be brought together and looked at holistically. And it's a lot easier to do that at the federal level than at the local level, or even the state level. So I think part of the strategy should be, are we even having those conversations about where the balance of power should be?
Other panelists.
I'd say a few things. I'm going to just select 3 quick examples. I think it's time for us to take control of the narratives. You know, so much of what we're doing, as you pointed out, Congressperson, is responding to their narratives, saying, no, you're wrong about that, as opposed to presenting our narratives. And I can think of 3 examples. One is what happened to kids during COVID. And nobody's done better research on this than Sean and his colleague Tom Kane. We know that what we characterize as opportunity gaps are, for some communities, becoming opportunity chasms. And we know that many of the districts where the politicians you're talking about occupy, those kids have suffered most. I have a case in California right now because kids went a year and a half without any education. I don't mean bad education. I mean no education. They didn't have the instrumentalities of learning when the classroom became their residences. They didn't have digital access. And we know the sorts of solutions that could actually begin to recapture what has been lost, which is decades of educational progress, like that. And we know what can be done. And part of our job is to make the other side answer as to how they justify it. In the Detroit case, when we presented the sort of examples I talked about, the fact that kids went to schools where the proficiency rates were 0. I don't mean poor, I mean 0. 0 kids, an entire school, who were proficient even at grade level, let alone more than that. The argument that the state came back with, and this is what they filed in their papers, was it was due to the intellectual limitations of the children and domestic violence of the kids. We've got to make them answer these questions as to why they're letting these kids, their own constituents' kids, languish because of what happened to COVID through no fault of individuals. Or take what's going on in your state and in my state and in states across the country. I have a case in Temecula, outside Riverside County, where children are not permitted to learn anything about systemic racism, where children are being banned from books. Books are being banned, including Peabody Award-winning books about growing up in the Jim Crow South, that they're not allowed to talk about systemic racism because it makes individuals uncomfortable. What's going on there? They want these kids to have identities that are incoherent, to not be able to explain what's going on, to not being able to address that. And we've got to make them answer these questions as to why they're doing this to kids and why they have justifications. And the last thing I would say is we have to go on the offensive. It can't be all defense. You're exactly right. It can't be about deficits of kids. It's got to be what's positive. I have a case in New York City right now to establish a constitutional right to an anti-racist education. Isn't that what education was supposed to be about? Not just teaching you the Pythagorean theorem, that's part of it, but also how to address racism in your society. I represent kids who had to put on the blackboard the pros and cons of slavery. I represent kids who were made to say the N-word in class. I represent kids who saw one of their classmates being made to get on the ground, and the teacher put his foot on the kid's neck and said that's what slavery was like. Children have a constitutional right to understand the racism in their society, to understand why some individuals don't get the same opportunities as others. And we have to fight for that. We have to make them tell that story. There was no justification for kids going into classrooms in Detroit without teachers. What was their argument? I told you what their argument was, but they had to answer that question. And they have to answer questions as to why kids are being treated in the way they do. And if we don't go on the offensive, then we are leaving these communities behind. And that's why I'm so proud to be a small part of your institute, because it's asking these questions and it's demanding answers. There are no answers to those questions, and that's why we're going to win.
Kristine, did you want to? You're like, I'm gonna leave it there. Josh, you're gonna.
I'll just follow up to build on Mark's point, not to diminish it, but so lawsuits, legal complaints, investigations, those can be disruptive, right? And as Mark said, force the other side to justify the actions. But they're also good at coordinating, organizing coalitions, and even better at controlling the narrative, right? So I think we got to do more litigation and lawsuits and complaints, and again, use all the rights that we have already. But, and this might be blasphemy in the law school, but at the end of the day, a court's not going to deliver justice. It's going to take political and social movements to bring about lasting change. And so I hope part of the focus of the Institute would be how do we start making those movements happen and sustaining those movements to make sure that we continue to apply the political pressure that's needed to make change lasting.
Yeah, and I'll just respond to that. That is definitely one of the aims of the Institute, is to tell the story of educational opportunity in America. Because I think, some of the polling data shows that people actually don't understand the opportunity gaps that we've been talking about today. And I think one of the reasons that we don't see systemic change is for that lack of understanding, not only that they exist, but why they matter, and also what we can do about them. So I think elevating the conversation around that is really critical to getting actual reform on those issues. So I'll take questions from the audience at this point. Okay. Wherever you want to start. She's starting.
Question earlier.
Okay.
So, anyway, this for Mark or anybody else on here. So you were talking about we have to make them answer, and I'm curious about who the them is, because I was following really carefully your case against the California State Department of Ed for the kids who didn't get learning in California. So my question is, who is the right them? And this is a big question across the country, because there are a lot of kids in various places that are not getting learning right now. Is this sort of a new thing that we're going to sue the State Department of Ed? Is that like should it be the federal Department of Ed? Should it be the state governor? Should it be the district? Just curious about that. And do you think it'll work?
Oh, it'll work. I believe in suing everybody in sight. But I'd say two things, Margaret, to your question. One is, you look at some of the great legal victories in our time, like Obergefell. And Obergefell wasn't won by lawyers, and it wasn't won by the law. Obergefell was actually behind the curve. And the first thing we have to do is talk to, as you've said, we have to talk to all individuals. Because in the end, when we hear some of the panelists talk about optimism, to me that is part of the optimism. The big part of the optimism is Jamaria and those students who are out there fighting for this and who want to learn. But the others are to give an opportunity to answer those questions. In Obergefell, when everyone recognized that it was about love, then it turned into a victory. And so I think that's part of our job too. If every person in America saw Jamaria and Kimberly as a child, we'd win in a walk. But I also believe that government has to be accountable. Sometimes even our allies have to be held accountable. That's why we create government. State government, federal government has an obligation to these children. That's why they were put there. That's why they build schoolhouses. That's why they have state departments of education. That's why they have state superintendents of education. It is their job to make sure that we don't even have to have fights like this. Like I said earlier, why are we talking in 2023 about a right to read? And that's their job. And I think every one of the cases we've brought, we've won, because when it came to crunch time in a trial, they didn't want the trial. Because they knew that people like Sean and you, Marguerite, and Prudence were going to talk about it, and because they knew that they were going to hear from kids to talk about it. You didn't need Sherlock Holmes to find out what was going on in those classrooms. Everybody knew about it. I once had a case where the lawyer who represented the governor of the state of California, I said to him, can't we just agree that kids should have books, because they didn't have books? And the lawyer for the state of California said, what difference would it make? They can't read anyway. And when that comes to the courtroom, when it comes to the public forum, we are going to win every time. And so I think it is about getting the message out publicly, letting the kids be the speakers, the principal spokespersons, and then I think it's about holding our officials accountable, whether they're frankly Democrat, Republican, but where they have a responsibility to these kids. That's why they were put in office, and they don't belong there if they're not prepared to give these kids these basic rights.
Next question.
So, picking up on something Mark said, so in litigation, it's also very important to be thinking about the remedy. And I think that's one thing that has been a challenge for the idea of a federal right to education, is that folks who might be skeptical of that hear federal right to education, and to them it seems absolutely huge. But federal involvement with state and local policymaking can take a lot of different forms, a lot of different shapes. You know, folks who are scholars of state and local government are used to thinking about that balance of power between those two governmental levels. And we also need to think about that at the state and federal level as well. So thinking about that, and in particular, I've learned a lot from Kimberly's work about different models of federalism. And also then connecting that to policy, tying that to a lawsuit so that it's not only telling this story, but also leading to policy change that's meaningful and important for communities, and that also thinks about that federal-state balance, I think is the big picture.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a proud graduate of a Detroit Public High School, so on behalf of all of my friends in my neighborhood that didn't graduate, my brother and I are 2 of 3 kids in our neighborhood we know of that went on to college. The unique piece of that is both of us, all 3 of us went to one of the 2 at the time exam public high schools in Detroit that graduated 99% of us. And so the disparities and inequalities between those of us, mostly African American, because Detroit is mostly black, all went to those 2 high schools, and all of us graduated. And our friends in our neighborhood didn't. And so the disparity within the disparity is real in Detroit, so thank you. I know that $94 million, I think, went to the district. It took a couple years because the Republican state legislature, of course, wasn't letting that allocation happen. Do you see the role as, so there's the immediate win, right, of money, which that's a good chunk of money. Obviously, school district budgets are massive, right? Do you see your role in this as the pragmatic, what's going to happen with the money, or is this, or is it the precedent that it sets legally for being able to do this in other places? And like, what's the follow-up, I guess, is the question.
It's a great question. You know, I don't think it's about making law. It's about making change. And I'm proud of the legal right that the decision by Judge Clay recognized. I'm proud that that has seen its way into other cases around the country, but it is about remedy. And it is my job, I see my job as a very small part of it, which is to open the door for remedy and to let those who know best what their families need, what their kids need, and what actually will work. Because it's not done existentially. It's done because these kids have such a fleeting opportunity to take these opportunities. My job is to open it up, do my part to open it up, and then to stand back for individuals like you to talk about what were the opportunities you got, what are the opportunities other kids should get under those circumstances, and get out of the way for real remedies. In law school, your students are taught exactly the wrong thing. They are taught to start with the lawsuit and get to the remedy. It's the other way around. You start with the remedy in terms of what will actually make a difference, and then you find a lawsuit that will help you to get there. And that's the only way that it makes a difference. It's not an existential exercise. It's life and death for these kids, and they deserve what actually works, and we know what works.
Congresswoman, I know I'm supposed to be passing the mic, but I'd love to ask you a question. We have so many people from so many, Virginia constituents, but also from across the country. Do you have any recommendations on how folks can advocate for a high-quality education in their respective communities, not just for their own children, but for children across the state and across the nation?
Well, first, run for office. If you have children in public schools, run for office, because a big part of the problem is the small percentage of policymakers who have children in public schools. In Congress, less than 7% of members of Congress are mothers of young children under the age of 18. Less than 7%. Less than 3% of us are mothers of color with children under 18. How many do you think have children in public schools? When I was in the House of Delegates, the chair of the K-12 subcommittee, his wife used to be a kindergarten teacher 30 years before he was the chair, and he would constantly, and it goes back to what I said, your policy views are shaped by your life experiences and what you know. So he would constantly say, well, when my wife was a kindergarten teacher, this is what was happening. And I would have to remind him, your wife was a kindergarten teacher in a school in Prince William County that had a lot of money and students that didn't look like me. So run for office or show up in the committee meetings. Show up at the Board of Education rulemakings. Show up to make sure your voice is being heard if you have children in public schools, or you're a public school teacher or an administrator, because too many of my colleagues, frankly, too many people running for school board right now have never set foot at a public school, let alone had children there. So we have got to make sure that the people in those school buildings, be they children, be they teachers, be they parents, be they principals, are making their voice heard at every level of policymaking when it comes to our schools.
Why aren't there more hearings, do you think, congressional hearings, televised, understood, where what you're talking about can take place?
So technically they're all televised, but the problem is that the people who are on those committees don't have kids in public schools. And it goes back to what is being taught in public schools. Civics education has been on the decline for a number of years, so most people don't know how to show up or watch. I mean, everything nowadays is at least live streamed, if not televised on C-SPAN or the local PBS channel, but how many people actually know about it? And most of the committee meetings are happening when the parents are at work, because it is designed, most government schedules are designed to keep people who have to work for a living from participating, is why.
All right.
I'm
going to, yes, exactly.
But you can show up, and you should.
I'm going to close us out for today with a excited thank you to all of you for being here today. Thank you for all the live streaming audience. And we are going to start a reception in about 5 to 10 minutes. In the meantime, we would ask that you scan this QR code to do a survey to let us know your feedback on the event so that we can learn from your experiences there here today. Thank you so much to my staff as well as Rebecca Claff and Laurel for their help today. And with that, we're going to close out. We'll start the reception soon. And we look forward to having all of you follow us on social media. All the social media is on the program, but I'll just shout it out. We have Facebook, X, as well as LinkedIn. Please follow us there. We will be sending out work, and I hope that you will continue to follow this work and continue to join us in this work to make sure that each and every student has access to a high-quality education. Thank you very much.